Hi guys, it's Thursday, it's my day off, and it's the perfect opportunity to produce another YouTube video. First of all, I'd like to thank Wigan Lusale for the inspiration behind this video. The comment was as follows: I'd like to know how football commentators avoid making mistakes. So that's what I'm going to be discussing today. Just before I get started, I'd like to thank all of the new subscribers for your support, and indeed the existing supporters and followers of this channel. We're getting very close to the 300 subscriber mark, so it'd be terrific if we could go over that milestone in the coming hours and days. So if you haven't done already, please subscribe. With that desperate plea out of the way, let's move on to the topic of today's video, which is how to avoid making mistakes. Now, football commentators, just like everyone else in any walk of life, are prone to the occasional slip. Errors can creep in. To err is human, but I prefer the Italian adage, sbagliando si impara. And I like to think over the course of the last 10 years or so, the time that I have been commentating, yes, I have committed these mistakes on at least one occasion, but I also like to think that thanks to my experience, I've been able to develop strategies and coping mechanisms so that if not to eliminate them completely, at least I can limit them and make them less obvious to the viewer and or a listener. Now, before we can look at mistakes in detail, I think it's important to actually define what constitutes an error for a football commentator. So I've decided to break these down into four main areas: mistaken identity, factual error, slip of the tongue, and pregnant pauses. So let's begin with the first one, mistaken identity. A football commentator's main role, our chief task, if you ask me, is to correctly identify the players. Lest we forget, there are pictures, the footage tells 99% of the story. We're there simply to inform the viewer as to who is doing what, who's got the ball, and so on and so forth. Which is why it's very important to be able to correctly identify the players. Unfortunately, there do come times when you're not necessarily 100% sure as to who is on the ball, or who has taken a shot, or who has made a save, or you'd hope so because there are only two goalkeepers, or who has headed the ball in a crowded penalty area, for instance. And when that happens, you need to take extreme caution. Unless you're 100% sure, do not say the name. The last thing you want to do is say the name and then have to retract it or backtrack or issue a correction. It's just not particularly pretty. Thankfully, we as English commentators are helped stylistically by the fact that typically we don't tend to say all of the names. Unlike, say, certain Latin languages in their commentary, I'm very exposed to Italian commentary over here, where typically commentators tend to say every single name, even when they're just playing the ball amongst them at the back. Now, I'm not going to get into the rights and wrongs and the merits of this particular strategy, but thankfully, as English commentators, we can almost pick and choose. We can make a selection of which names we say. So if I'm not 100% sure of who's got the ball there, then maybe I'll miss out that name and come back in on the next one, or I might say something generic. So obviously that's a coping mechanism. But there does come a time when a specific name is indispensable, namely when a goal goes in. Now, what do you do with that? Well, typically, and I'll probably address this in another video, when a goal goes in, there are around 4 question words and they have a certain priority. Who? So who's scoring the goal? What? What does it mean in terms of the context? Team X has opened the scoring. Team Y has completed a turnaround. How? So then you're talking over a replay, or maybe your co-commentators doing so if you are joined by a colleague. And then why? How has the goal come about? What have they done specifically? And why did the goal come to pass? But when you don't know who scored the goal, the who naturally has to come later, and you have to fill. You basically have to buy yourself some time until you're absolutely sure as to who scored the goal. This can happen for a number of different reasons. Maybe it's a crowded penalty area, as I mentioned earlier on. Maybe the players go and celebrate in a big huddle or a big bundle. And I experienced this recently. I was 95 to 99% sure of the following goal scorer, but I thought I'd show you this clip as an example of how to fill and how long it can actually take to discover who scored the goal. And it's very interesting to see whether or not a viewer who's not a commentator by trade would actually even be aware of the fact the commentator doesn't know who scored the goal. Anyway, here's the clip.
Fiorini sends it in. Pierotti's header. Away by Jabwa. Kiti goes to ground. Chance for Fiorentina, and they level. Beautifully taken. Struck so purely on the half volley. And shades of the opening goal for Atalanta. The ball wasn't cleared. It dropped really invitingly. And Agostinelli cracked it past the goalkeeper.
So that's mistaken identity. Now we have factual errors. Of course, all commentators worth their salt do put plenty of time in, lots of hours, poring over statistics, studying, hitting the books to make sure that we know as much as possible about both teams, about the players, the referees, the managers, the context of the match. But there do occasionally come times when we might say something incorrect, which is why it's so important to check facts.
You see, in America, we are taught to check a fact before it becomes a fact.
Just because you read something in a newspaper or you read a tweet or you speak to a journalist that covers that team, it's always a good idea just to make absolutely sure and double check that what you're actually saying publicly on a broadcast is indeed the truth. Otherwise, it can leave you with egg on your face. But there do come times as well when factual errors can creep in, even when you've prepared some data. I remember that I was talking anecdotally the other day. I mentioned a specific goal which was very important from 4 or 5 seasons ago, which allowed a certain team to qualify for the Champions League with a late goal. And curiously, I said that that goal came from the penalty spot. It didn't. And then I was kicking myself afterwards because I thought, you didn't check that. You've just relied on your memory. Your memory has betrayed you there. And you could have actually been a bit vaguer about that. Similarly, I also came out with another statistic after a goal recently where I said it was X number of league games since he had scored, and I quoted the number which was actually the number from all competitions. The league games number was less than that. So these are just minor slips, but they are frustrating when they creep in, and they are avoidable. So there it's a case of making sure that you double check things, maybe even have a glance down at your notes before you say something, and only say something if you're 100% convinced that you've prepared that in advance or you are absolutely sure that that information is correct. That's how to avoid factual errors. Moving on, we have the slip of the tongue. Now, this can happen in a number of different ways, and who knows why it happens. I've occasionally had a slip of the tongue over something that I've scripted beforehand. Often, I script my introduction and my team news so they match up with timings, but sometimes I'll write things in such a sloppy way that I'm not able to read my handwriting when the pressure is on, and then I'm left kicking myself. Now, clearly, the solution to that is to take a bit more care and attention, a bit more time over my handwriting to make sure it's very clear. Might even write in capitals, or you could even type it on a computer if you have the means and the time to do so. So that's very avoidable with regards to an error. After all, it's scripted. It should be seamless. The trick comes in trying to make it sound not scripted when, of course, you read it out. The next slip of the tongue can occur when you've got people talking in your ear. There's talkback. It might be the producer or the match director, and you need to learn to be able to deal with that. My training personally as a conference interpreter really helped me on that, in that we tend to have one of our 2 headphones uncovered, and that means that what we're hearing in our headphones is normally of a lower volume than what we're hearing when we speak. It's actually our uncovered ear, which is just keeping tabs on what we say. I remember when I first started training as a conference interpreter, what I was saying came out very garbled because I was too focused on what I was hearing. And the same goes there. Ultimately, your job is to be able to broadcast in a very clear, concise, entertaining fashion. And the last thing you want to do is be distracted by what you're hearing in your ear because someone is telling you they're about to show you a shot of this, or someone is asking you to apologize for a bit of expletives on air. So you need to be able to ultimately find coping mechanisms so that what you're hearing in your ear is not distracting you from the output and what you're able to say. Pronunciation is another tricky one as well. I've spoken about this at length in the past. There is no right and wrong way of doing things. Personally, I believe in trying to be as authentic as possible with pronunciation. No one expects you to get near native level accuracy. However, I think the most important thing is to find a way of saying it and to be consistent with that. So good practice is perhaps to actually try out things during the sound check prior to kickoff. What happens there is maybe you're told to mimic a passage of play because you need a goal call for the levels. And there it might simply be a case of saying one name after another, saying it nice and clearly so that you're sure of how you're going to say that name. Unfortunately, when the pressure is on, occasionally things can come awry. I had that recently with the former Arsenal goalkeeper, Wojciech Szczęsny. I tried to say his name in as authentic a way as possible, having heard the following on Forvo.
Wojciech Szczęsny. Wojciech Szczęsny.
But in hindsight, perhaps I could have chosen a slightly easier way to say the name. Szczęsny, as people have said in the past. He had a long career in England, but I've always tried to say Szczęsny because I say Drągowski and I say Piątek, albeit he's no longer playing in Serie A, so I don't have much opportunity to say Krzysztof Piątek's name. A lot of people say Krzysztof anyway. So there, that might simply be a case of me repeating the line. If and when it comes out garbled, a way of coping with that is, yes, the mistake has been made, but maybe you repeat the line, and then it certainly helps those that are cutting things up in post-production. Lest we forget, a lot of the work we're doing is being used for highlight form, which is why if you ever wonder when a commentator does get a player's name wrong on a goal, if you wonder why they tend to plough on regardless and rather bullishly just carry on and say the name as if it was water off a duck's back, that's so it's not as conspicuous to the viewer, and above all, so that it can be used in post-production. The last thing you want to do is say, actually, no, sorry, it wasn't him, it was him. It just sounds a little bit untidy. So that is what we call a slip of the tongue, and there are some possible ways to deal with it. So make sure that your handwriting is clear, make sure you know how to deal with talkback, make sure your pronunciation is authentic but not too difficult so you're tying yourself up in knots. And if you do end up making a mistake, make sure you say that line again, repeat it nice and cleanly and clearly. So finally, we have the pregnant pauses. Pregnant pauses can be good when used deliberately for effect. I can say something and then pause and really give it lots of emphasis, maybe even put a bit of a growl in my voice. But the worst thing is when you start a sentence and midway through you realize you haven't got the foggiest idea where it is you're trying to get to. I had this a couple of times recently after goals went in. Thankfully, the first and second and third, maybe even fourth lines were good, but the fifth line might have gone slightly awry. And just like this, you start to think, what am I going to say? And this can occasionally then trigger other mistakes because you almost start to say a word and then midway through you think, okay, I'm going to try and change my direction, and it actually triggers a whole host of other mistakes. It's like a domino effect. So the trick is there, once again, when a goal goes in, get that first line out, get the goal scorer's name in as and when you know it as quickly as possible, and then focus on telling the story. Again, I'll try and go through what makes a good goal call, again, in my mind, to my eyes, in another video, but it's very important that you try and limit these mistakes simply by knowing what it is you want to say, taking your time, pacing things. A pause is never a bad idea. Let the game breathe, as we say when it comes to English commentary. So there you have it. Hopefully some strategies and coping mechanisms there when errors inevitably creep in. Mistakes do happen, but the very best in the business almost don't seem to make any. I'm sure they do make some, but it's very hard to pick up on it when there is a slip creeping in. So that's what you need to strive for. That comes with experience and confidence, and also knowing to very quickly move on when a mistake does happen, much like a golfer. If you miss a 3-footer and it goes 6 feet by, you need to just pause, take your time, and make sure you hold the putt coming back in and not lose your cool. Easier said than done. Wigan, thank you very much for the question. I hope some of you all found value in that as well. Please comment in the section below if there are any other mistakes that I haven't listed here or covered here. Once again, I'm only talking from my own experience. I would never take it upon myself to judge the work of my colleagues. And again, I've been in this business for only 10 years, so take what you hear with a pinch of salt. Like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't done already, notification bell if you're really keen to know every time I post a video, and I will see you on the next one. Cheers, guys.